Two classified Israeli outposts detected in the Iraqi desert. Iran outlines a mathematical certainty regarding U.S. warships in the Gulf of Oman. The White House formalizes a structural, bilateral framework with Beijing. The U.S. Senate gridlocks over a $1 billion White House security expenditure. The 2026 World Cup apparatus scrambles to counter an asymmetrical drone threat. You are watching the Daily International Briefing on my YouTube channel. I am James Spencer Hayes. Let us bypass the political theater and examine the architecture of power. A New York Times investigation has revealed a stark operational reality. In early March 2026, in Iraq's western desert, the illusion of territorial sovereignty evaporated. Awat Anshamari, a 29-year-old shepherd in the An-Nuhaib region, drove his pickup truck for routine supplies. Hours later, the vehicle was a burning husk, neutralized by rotary wing gunfire. The local assessment confirms a helicopter pursued and systematically dismantled the vehicle before it halted in the sand. Regional security officials confirm the structural truth. This site is one of at least two temporary forward operating bases constructed by Israel on Iraqi soil. Their purpose is strictly logistical. They exist to shorten the operational radius for Israeli aircraft projecting power toward Iran, providing covered refueling and medical extraction. The Wall Street Journal previously indicated a single node. The New York Times now confirms multiple. This is not a mere border breach. It is an escalation infrastructure. When forward operating bases expand, the probability of regional ignition approaches absolute certainty. That probability is priced directly into the global commodities market, meaning you're already paying for this desert outpost through systemic inflation at the gas pump. Meanwhile, Middle Eastern and South Asian intermediaries are aggressively attempting to inject liquidity into a bankrupt diplomatic process between the US and Iran. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif engaged Qatari Prime Minister Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani on May 17. The Qatari Foreign Ministry confirmed discussions centered on Pakistani mediation efforts to stabilize the region. Simultaneously, Pakistan's Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Mohammad Ishaq Dar initiated talks with Egypt's Foreign Minister Badr Abdelati, emphasizing political dialogue to prevent military escalation. Furthermore, Pakistan's Interior Minister Mohsen Naqvi traveled to Tehran to meet Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who correctly diagnosed that recent hostilities have severely degraded the Middle Eastern baseline. Let us reframe this. Pakistan is not acting out of humanitarian grace. They are a heavily leveraged state, entirely dependent on energy imports. A prolonged US-Iran kinetic exchange would sever supply chains and trigger sovereign defaults across emerging markets. Pakistan is mediating because their own domestic macro stability is tethered to the Strait of Hormuz. It is not diplomacy, it is self-preservation. Yet, the core asymmetries remain untouched, and the major players remain entirely deadlocked. In Tel Aviv, the logistical supply lines are fully activated. Dozens of U.S. transport aircraft, originating from installations in Germany, have touched down over the past 24 hours. The cargo is munitions. Israeli Channel 13 and the Times of India confirm this airlift aligns precisely with historical indicators of an imminent kinetic phase against Iran. The New York Times, citing inside sources, notes that operational planning is complete. Iran could face renewed strikes within the week. Advisors to President Donald Trump have mapped out the strategic options, ranging from aggressive, large-scale airstrikes to deploying ground-level special operations units to physically extract enriched uranium from Iranian nuclear facilities. The U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, and the Israeli military upper echelon are finalizing the kill chains. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's posture remains absolute. NBC News reports the Pentagon is floating the operational designation, Operation Sledgehammer, poised to replace the April 28 deployment known as Operation Epic Fury, should the current ceasefire collapse. On May 19, President Trump convenes his senior national security apparatus in the Situation Room. Speaking to Axios, The president outlined the leverage. The clock is running out, and absent substantial concessions on the nuclear program, Tehran will absorb a disproportionate blow. Israel's state broadcaster, Kan, citing anonymous security officials, confirmed Israeli integration into any new offensive, specifically targeting Iran's energy infrastructure. Make no mistake, when a sovereign energy grid is targeted, the shockwave hits the global market instantly. The cost of manufacturing, the cost of transport, the cost of your groceries, all of it spikes. It is inflation delivered by ballistic missile. Iran's response is a cold reading of geopolitical physics. On May 17, Major General Mohsen Rezaee, senior advisor to the Supreme Leader, stated explicitly that the Gulf of Oman will transition into a graveyard for American warships unless Washington lifts its naval blockade. He categorized the blockade not as sanctions, but as a hard act of war. His logic is unassailable from Tehran's perspective. An act of war justifies a reciprocal kinetic response. Rezaee warned that Tehran's current restraint should not be mispriced by Washington as submission. If they are patient, they are merely calculating the optimal moment to strike. He dismantled the justification for an extended U.S. military presence in the Gulf, reinforcing that the Strait of Hormuz remains open for commercial transit but fundamentally closed to Western military expansion. They hold the geographical choke point handling a fifth of the world's oil. That is true leverage. In West Africa, the leverage shifts to counter-insurgency. On May 17, Nigerian President Bola Tinubu confirmed a coordinated tactical strike by Nigerian armed forces and the U.S. military. The target, Abu Bilal al-Mandouk, a high-value commander of the Islamic State in the Lake Chad Basin. The operation neutralized him and multiple subordinates within their structural stronghold. Tinubu branded this a critical degradation of extremist networks and a testament to U.S.-Nigerian security cooperation. The macroeconomic reality is the stabilization of a resource-heavy theater. Extremist violence creates volatility. Volatility deters foreign direct investment. By utilizing U.S. intelligence and Nigerian ground forces to eliminate this node, Washington and Abuja are securing the commercial viability of the Lake Chad region. It is a necessary exertion of force to protect the flow of capital. This localized stabilization is desperately needed, as global supply chains are currently buckling under the anticipation of a prolonged Middle Eastern conflict. Bloomberg's latest analytical surveys reveal a structural shift. While the May Purchasing Managers' Index for major economies nominally remains in growth territory, this is a statistical illusion. The growth is artificially inflated by panic buying. Corporations are aggressively hoarding raw materials and front-loading imports to hedge against energy deficits and logistical collapse. This preemptive stockpiling drives up input costs, which are inevitably passed down to the consumer. Central banks are monitoring this closely ahead of June's monetary policy decisions. The economic shockwaves are highly asymmetric. Germany and the Eurozone are absorbing heavy structural damage, while the UK and Japan exhibit superior resilience. The macroeconomic anxiety provides the backdrop for the G7 finance ministers convening in Paris on May 18. The agenda is growth, bond market volatility, and severe economic imbalances. The subtext is rare earth minerals. Simultaneously, the White House announced that President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping finalized a substantive, bilateral framework during Trump's May 13 to 15 state visit to Beijing. The focus was supply chain stabilization and strategic parity. The headline is that China has committed to addressing U.S. structural vulnerabilities regarding critical minerals, specifically neodymium, scandium, and yttrium, and rolling back restrictions on rare earth processing technologies. Let us translate that Beijing holds a near monopoly on the elements required for your smartphone, your electric vehicle, and the Pentagon's precision-guided munitions. This agreement is an attempt to mitigate that massive asymmetrical leverage. Furthermore, Beijing has executed an advance purchase of 200 Boeing aircraft, the first major order since 2017. They also committed to importing a baseline of $17 billion in U.S. agricultural products annually from 2026 to 2028, restoring access for American beef and poultry. In return, Washington and Beijing pledged mutual support for hosting the upcoming G20 and APEC summits. On the geopolitical chessboard, both powers aligned on preventing a nuclear-armed Iran, maintaining open transit through the Strait of Hormuz without toll extraction, and the denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. It is a transactional stabilization, managed by two newly established bilateral trade and investment councils. Pivoting to Eastern Europe, the Ukrainian Security Service, the SBU, under the command of Major General Yevheny Kamara, executed a massive, coordinated drone offensive against the Russian Federation on the night of May 17. Alpha Group special forces bypassed Russian air defense arrays to strike high-value military-industrial nodes in the Moscow region and a Crimean airbase. The Russian Defense Ministry claimed the interception of over 550 Ukrainian drones across 14 regions. The structural reality, corroborated by SBU flight data, is that critical infrastructure was compromised. The targets were deliberate and strategic. The Moscow oil refinery in Kapotnia, two major fuel pipeline transit stations in Solnechnogorsk and Volodarsky, and the Angstrom semiconductor plant in Zelenograd, a facility under U.S. sanctions that produces microchips for the Russian defense sector. Hitting a refinery and fuel pipelines directly chokes the logistical lifeblood of the capital. TASS news agency, citing local officials, reported at least 3 fatalities near Moscow in what constitutes the largest aerial assault on the capital in over a year. This is a war of industrial attrition, played out in real time. In Washington, the illusion of legislative efficiency has collided with procedural reality. Senate parliamentarian Elizabeth McDonough has rejected a $1 billion provision in the Republican budget reconciliation bill. This expenditure was earmarked for upgrading White House security and constructing a new reception room for President Trump. McDonough ruled that this specific capital outlay does not meet the strict criteria for budget reconciliation. The procedural math is brutal. Passing this now requires 60 votes, rather than a simple majority. This throws a massive structural roadblock in front of the $72 billion budget package. The $1 billion line item included $220 million for White House perimeter defense, ballistic glass, and drone detection systems, $180 million for a visitor screening center, and $600 million for Secret Service training and enhanced protective measures following recent assassination attempts. While Republicans argue the Democrats are mischaracterizing the funds, the reality is that allocating $1 billion for executive security while the average citizen navigates crushing inflation is a difficult narrative to sell. The vulnerability to asymmetric aerial threats extends beyond the White House. Federal and local authorities are scrambling to secure the venues for the 2026 World Cup against autonomous drone swarms, with the tournament mere weeks away. Politico reports severe operational gaps. A recent 2-month shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security severely degraded preparation timelines. Security officials are deeply concerned about unauthorized drones, ranging from nuisance flights disrupting play to catastrophic payload deliveries, including the theoretical deployment of radiological material. You have millions of fans converging on the US, Mexico, and Canada, protected by an ad hoc, historically fragmented counter-drone architecture spread across Customs and Border Protection, the TSA, the Coast Guard, and the Secret Service. The infrastructure is lagging behind the threat matrix. Finally, in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, India is executing a $9 billion infrastructure deployment on Great Nicobar Island. The blueprint includes a deep water port, an airport, and a new urban center. Located nearly 3,000 kilometers from the Indian mainland, this is not merely an economic development project. It is the construction of a geopolitical choke point. The facility sits at the eastern gateway to the Indian Ocean, directly adjacent to the Strait of Malacca, the arterial waterway where 30% of global trade transits. By establishing a massive logistical and container hub here, New Delhi is permanently altering the naval architecture of the Indo-Pacific, securing long-term leverage over global maritime supply chains. That concludes our assessment of the global power matrix for today. The facts dictate the narrative. Ensure you remain informed. Like, share, and subscribe to the VNA Media YouTube channel for continuous geopolitical analysis. I am James Spencer Hayes. Thank you for your time.